First, I start by sketching the basic outline with very light pencil lines. At this stage, the drawing doesn't need to be perfect. These lines are just a guide to help me place the object on the surface. Many people think that illusion drawings start with complicated techniques, but the truth is, everything begins with a very simple sketch. Right now the shape might look a little strange, stretched, or even distorted, but that's actually the secret behind 3D illusion drawings. What looks incorrect from this angle will later appear completely normal from the correct perspective. This technique is called anamorphic perspective, and it's used in many famous street art illusions around the world. Now I'm adding the main structure of the drawing. These lines will define the shape and the form of the object. At this stage I focus on proportions and angles. I slowly adjust the lines to make sure the object looks balanced from the viewing angle. Sometimes I step back and check the drawing from the camera's perspective, because illusion art isn't about how it looks from every angle. It's about how it looks from one perfect viewpoint. Once the structure feels right, I begin strengthening the main lines. Now we move on to the part where the drawing starts coming to life. Shadows. Shading is one of the most important parts of creating a realistic illusion. Without shadows, the drawing will always look flat. So I start adding darker tones in the areas where light wouldn't reach. For example, underneath edges, inside curves, or behind parts of the object. The darker the shadow, the deeper the surface appears. Our brain naturally interprets darker areas as depth. That's why even a simple shape can start looking three-dimensional when shading is added correctly. Now I begin refining the contrast. Contrast means the difference between light and dark. If everything has the same tone, the drawing will feel flat, but when we create strong contrast, the illusion becomes much more powerful. So I darken some edges and keep other areas lighter. This balance between light and shadow tricks the brain into believing the surface is going inward or popping outward. Sometimes I also blend the shading to make it smoother. This makes the illusion feel more natural and realistic. At this stage, the drawing is starting to look more convincing. Now I focus on the smaller details. Details are what make the illusion believable. I sharpen the edges, adjust the shadows, and add subtle highlights. Highlights represent where light hits the surface. Even tiny white areas can dramatically improve realism. I also check the overall balance of the drawing. If one side feels too dark or too bright, I adjust it carefully. This step requires patience, because small changes can make a big difference. Right now, if you look at the drawing straight from above, it still looks like a normal sketch on paper, but illusion art is all about the viewing angle. So now I slowly move the camera to the correct position, and watch what happens. Suddenly, the distorted shapes align perfectly, the shadows fall into place, and the flat drawing transforms into a realistic three-dimensional object. It almost looks like the object is rising out of the paper. That's the magic of perspective. As I continue working on the illusion, I start drawing a small bridge that connects one column to the other. I carefully sketch the bridge from column to column, making sure the lines follow the same perspective as the rest of the drawing. Even though the bridge looks slightly stretched on the flat surface, this distortion is necessary so that it appears perfectly straight from the viewing angle. I add gentle curves and small details along the edges to make the structure look more realistic, almost like a tiny architectural bridge suspended between the pillars. Then I begin adding shadows underneath the bridge and along the sides of the columns, so it feels like the bridge is actually floating above the surface rather than sitting on it. With a bit of shading and subtle highlights, the small bridge suddenly becomes an important part of the illusion, visually linking the two columns and making the entire 3D scene feel more connected and believable. Once the main form is ready, I start adding details that make the bridge feel more realistic. I refine the edges, smooth the lines, and add small structural hints along the sides so it looks like a tiny piece of architecture suspended between the pillars. Then comes one of the most important steps, shading. I add darker shadows underneath the bridge, and along the sides where the light wouldn't naturally reach. This shadow creates the illusion that the bridge is slightly lifted above the surface, rather than simply drawn on the page. I also shade the areas where the bridge meets the columns, giving the impression that the structure is firmly attached to both sides. By gradually blending the shadows and leaving some areas lighter, the bridge begins to feel more three-dimensional. The highlights along the top edge suggest light hitting the surface, while the darker underside creates the sense of depth and separation from the background. I can see the small bridge look like a real object connecting the two columns. At this point, it doesn't feel like a simple drawing anymore. It actually starts looking like a tiny structure that could exist in real space. To really show how convincing the illusion is, I step onto the floating bridge and slowly walk across it, from one column to the other. It looks like I'm actually standing and walking on the bridge itself. This is the moment where the illusion really comes to life.